The long jump is quite a complicated event, particularly when you want to get really good at it. We're going to take a look at trunk angle, the angle at which the body takes off, whether you lean back, whether you're neutral, or whether you lean into the takeoff. Why is that important in the first place? Well, the inclination of the torso and the angle indeed through the whole body can determine the speed at least at which you take off at, and also the height at which you go up off of the board as well. Remember, for the long jump, you've got two velocity values. You've got horizontal and vertical, and the angle of the torso and the inclination of the body and its change across the takeoff can have a big influence. Some of the top jumpers, such as Miltiadis Tentoglu, lean from the board. It's very distinct if you really focus on it when you're looking at them on a video. Now, why do they do that? It's to carry more velocity across the board. Other jumpers, such as Ivana Spanovic, for example, lean back slightly as they take off. Now, this does not mean that they're leaning in prior to take off on their run-up and their penultimate and the third step out. They can, in fact, be neutral or slightly leaning back by a few degrees. However, the likes of Tentoglu, by switching across the board, will carry that momentum through into the takeoff. You then have the issue of trying to combat the forward rotation that has ensued from that takeoff trunk angle in particular. And that's why the majority of jumpers that do lean more off of the board do a 2.5 stride hitch kick, so that the movements in the air can combat the forward rotation and pull their torso back into an almost leaning back position when they come into the landing. So in short, you really have to fight to combat rotation using counter-rotational movements in the air, long levers. Now, there are other jumpers that have more of a negative torso angle, trunk angle on take-off, and that often issues in greater vertical velocity. If you lean back, if you think about it, you're going to take your weight back more, whereas if you lean forwards, you're over the takeoff foot more quickly. Therefore, by pressing the foot out as a consequence of a potential lean back or deliberate negative torso angle, more time on the board and therefore greater vertical velocity. In talking about this, we also have to consider the head. If the head remains in a neutral position, then you can move your torso without additional effect of the weight of the head, whereas many jumpers, particularly at the beginning and intermediate level, can take their head back, for example, on takeoff. That's going to pull the shoulders back and the torso, create more of a longer last stride and a potential blocking on the board as well, and greater vertical velocity. Obviously, if you're looking down at the board as you come in, then the reverse can happen, and the shoulders in particular can rotate forwards and bring the torso forwards at takeoff as well. So regardless of your torso angle, you really want to have your head in a neutral position so that it doesn't affect what you're trying to do when you're taking off. For clarification, there is a slight difference, or a real difference actually, between the torso angle and the body angle, in that from a torso's perspective you can be leaning forwards, for example, whereas you can be quite upright below the waist, or you can have an angle through the whole body as well as a torso angle as well. So those are factors that all impinge on how the takeoff happens and how it works. So, having said that, let's take a look at a couple of elite jumpers and statistics from world athletics and their trunk and torso angles. Let's start with Juan Miguel Echavarria, who's just recently returned to competition. Now, according to the statistics from the 2017 World Athletics Championships, he had a body inclination angle at touchdown on the board of minus 32.2 degrees. Then a body inclination angle at takeoff of 13.5. However, his trunk angle at touchdown was minus 16.3 degrees and still negative at minus 6.4 at takeoff. Now, we know that Echavarria is an eccentrically dominant jumper who tends to press his foot out quite a long way on takeoff. So that would explain the negative values. He gets greater vertical velocity and gets his distance from that, perhaps more so than his horizontal velocity, though of course the latter is important or crucial. Okay, let's take a look at a more speed orientated jumper in that they carry more horizontal velocity across the board. Marquis, Dendy. Now, Dendy had a body inclination angle at touchdown of minus 35.3 degrees, a body inclination angle at takeoff of 20.1 degrees, a trunk angle at touchdown of 0.3 degrees, and a trunk angle at takeoff of 4.7 degrees. So you can see as he goes forwards across the board, the trunk and the takeoff angle decreases and becomes shallower, which should enable him to take more horizontal velocity, in particular across the board. Just for reference, in terms of trunk angle, the jumper with the greatest inclination of the trunk at takeoff was Rushwai Samai from South Africa, whose was 10.4 degrees. And Tentoglu, albeit this was about 7 or 8 years ago when he wasn't jumping the distances that he is now, had an inclination of 2.8 degrees, so not as much. But it shows that at that point he was leaning forwards. And if you look at Samai, you can really see the lean through the torso when he takes off. Now, there's a lot more to this as well, as the positioning over the last 3 steps, and in particular the length of the penultimate and crucially the last step, the takeoff step, do of course have an effect on body angles and torso angles. And as I've indicated also, we need to be aware of what the head does as well. As coaches and jumpers, why do we need to concern ourselves with these values? Well, you've got to work out what angles across the body and in the torso are most beneficial for the type of jumper you're coaching or you are. The more you know, the more difficult it becomes, as I've found out, and it can become a little bit of a minefield actually trying to do that. For example, with Abraham, we have experimented with leaning into the takeoff. We've also experimented with the torso being more upright at takeoff as well. And we're just trying to evaluate what's most effective. If he sets himself up properly, optimally on the penultimate, then gets his foot down underneath him, then he may need to be slightly more upright at takeoff. Otherwise, too much of an inclination through the torso, for example, will create too much rotation. And as he's doing a single hitch kick and has some issues clearing the board and opening his chest, which doesn't enable sufficient control of the rotation, I should say, then perhaps we are going to struggle a little bit more with trying to lean too much into the takeoff. If you do lean into the takeoff, the jumper seems to have more of a feeling of accelerating through the board. It's in their mind as they're coming into the takeoff that they need to be moving forwards across the board. So that can be an added benefit of trying to position to move forwards and then angle the body and the torso so that it does almost pull you forwards off of the takeoff. The technique that you do also has an effect on the angles of the torso and the body at takeoff, in that a sail stroke side jump technique can create more backward rotation because there's a tendency to press the foot out in order to take off in a balanced position, because with the stride jump, for example, you don't want to take the torso forwards with you because you're not going to do anything substantial in the air to combat rotation. The movement of the arms, for example, are post takeoff, hold, rotate the rear arm behind and push the front arm up. So if you're leading with the torso and you cannot get into this position, but even if you do get into that position, I should say, and you're leaning forwards, then you're not doing anything to combat that rotation, and therefore the likelihood is that you're going to drop in early. Obviously, if you're doing a hitch kick or a hitch hang to an extent, you can combat rotation by the counter-rotational movements in the air, as I've explained. So technique will have a bearing on torso angle. It's another factor to put into the equation when working out how you should actually try to position your torso and your body angle across the board and through into the jump. Please do consider becoming a channel member. At supporter level, for just $1.99 a month, £1.99 a month, you can do just that, i.e. support the channel. If you want to find out more information and go more in depth or get access to my month-by-month training programs and plans, then you could consider becoming a Coach Athlete channel member. To gain access to Coach Athlete member videos or become a channel supporter, head over to the channel's homepage, click on the membership button, and you'll be taken through to the various membership offerings. Well, thanks for watching, especially if you got through to the end of the video. Do like and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next video.